The ship appeared above Earth on a Tuesday morning in the year 2147, and it was larger than anything humanity had ever seen in. The Sky Ambassador Vethel of the Corvani Empire stood at the observation deck of his vessel and looked down at the blue and green world. Below him, with a mixture of boredom and mild curiosity, for he had done this exact thing more than 40 times before with 40 different species, and they had all responded in exactly the same way. First came the panic. Then came the desperate attempts at communication. Then came the military posturing that always failed. And finally came the surrender that the galactic hegemony had grown to expect from every civilization they encountered. The hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. And in all that time, not a single species had successfully resisted them. Because resistance was simply not possible. When you faced an empire that controlled 10 million star systems and commanded fleets that could crack planets like eggs, Vethel transmitted his message to every communication device on the planet below, and his words were translated instantly into every human language. People of Earth, he announced in a voice that carried the weight of countless worlds, I am Ambassador Vethel of the Galactic Hegemony, and I come to you with a simple choice that every species before you has faced. And that choice is this. You may submit to integration into our great empire and serve us as all species must serve, or you may refuse and be destroyed. And you have 14 of your solar cycles to make this decision. He ended the transmission and waited for the fear to begin on Earth. The message played on every screen and every speaker in every corner of the world. And for a long moment, humanity simply listened in the headquarters of the United Earth Council. The leaders of the human race gathered in a large room filled with screens showing the massive alien ship hanging in their sky. And Secretary General Maria Santos stood at the head of the table with her hands folded calmly in front of her. Well, she said, looking around at the faces of presidents and prime ministers and generals. That was certainly something. The room remained quiet, but it was not the quiet of fear or despair, because humanity had lived through too much to be frightened by threats from the sky. They had survived ice ages that killed nearly everything on their planet, and they had survived plagues that wiped out half their population, and they had survived wars that burned their cities to ash, and they had survived the slow poison of their own pollution that had nearly choked their world to death. They had survived themselves, which was perhaps the hardest thing of all. General Chen Wei of the United Defense Force leaned forward and asked the question everyone was thinking. What do we do? Madam Secretary Maria Santos looked up at the screen showing the alien vessel, and she thought about all the times in human history when powerful forces had demanded submission from those they considered weaker. And she thought about how those demands had been met with fear and compliance, more often than not. But she also thought about the times when people had simply refused to be afraid. We do nothing, she said. The room erupted in confused voices, but she raised her hand for silence. They expect us to panic, she continued. And they expect us to beg, and they expect us to fight with weapons that cannot possibly match theirs. Because that is what every other species has done. And that is why every other species has lost. She walked to the window and looked up at the dark shape blocking out the stars. We are not going to give them what they expect. Because we are human, and if there is one thing we have learned in our long and difficult history, it is that the only power fear has over us is the power we choose to give it. She turned back to face the council. We are going to decline their offer. And then we are going to go about our lives as if they are not there, because they do not matter to us. And we will not give them the satisfaction of mattering. 2 days later, Ambassador Vethel received a formal response from the United Earth Council, and it was exactly 3 sentences long. Thank you for your message, it read. The people of Earth have considered your offer of integration into the galactic hegemony, and we respectfully decline. We wish you safe travels on your journey home. Vithal read the message 7 times. Because surely he had misunderstood something. In 3,000 years of hegemony conquest, no species had ever simply said no. And certainly no species had ever wished them safe travels. Afterward, as if they were guests who had overstayed their welcome. At a dinner party, he immediately requested a meeting with Earth's leaders to clarify what he assumed must be some kind of translation error. The meeting took place in a conference room in Geneva, and Vethal arrived with a guard of 12 heavily armed Corvani soldiers, their weapons gleaming with the promise of destruction. Secretary General Santos arrived with a pot of coffee and a plate of pastries. "Ambassador," she said warmly as she poured him a cup. "Please, sit down and make yourself comfortable." Vethal remained standing, his confusion turning slowly to anger. "You do not seem to understand your situation," he said. "My fleet can reduce your cities to rubble in a matter of hours, and my empire can erase your entire species from existence as easily as you might step on an insect." Maria Santos took a sip of her coffee and nodded thoughtfully. "I am sure that is true," she replied. "You are clearly very powerful, and we are clearly very small compared to your great empire. Then why do you refuse us?" Vethal demanded. Santos set down her cup and looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no anger, and no desperation. Only a kind of patient calm that Vethal had never seen in any species he had conquered. "Because we are tired," she said simply. "We are tired of being afraid, Ambassador, and we have decided to stop." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below where people were going about their ordinary lives despite the alien ships in their sky. "You can destroy us," she continued. "That is certainly within your power, but you cannot make us afraid. Because fear is something we give, not something you can take. And we have chosen not to give it anymore." Vethal stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time in his long career as a conqueror, he felt something he did not recognize. It was not until much later that he would understand it was the beginning of doubt. He left Earth that day with a simple message for his superiors. Something was very wrong with this species, and they would need to send the fleet to understand exactly what it was. The hegemony fleet arrived on the 14th day, exactly as Ambassador Vethal had promised, and it was a sight that would have brought any other species to its knees in terror. 3,000 warships emerged from hyperspace, in perfect formation, each one bristling with weapons capable of melting continents, and they arranged themselves in a sphere around Earth like a cage made of metal and fire. Admiral Korath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and looked down at the small blue world that had dared to refuse the hegemony's generous offer of submission. He was a veteran of 100 conquests, and he had seen every possible response to hegemony aggression, from desperate last stands to immediate groveling surrender, and he had crushed them all with equal efficiency. This would be no different, he told himself. He broadcast his message to every corner of the planet below. "People of Earth, your time has run out, and your refusal has been noted. But the hegemony is merciful to those who recognize their mistakes. So I give you one final chance to surrender and be integrated peacefully into our empire, or face the consequences of your foolish defiance." He waited for a response, because there was always a response at this stage. The leaders would scramble to communicate with him, offering desperate bargains and pleading for mercy. And his psychological warfare specialists would analyze their fear responses and use that information to break them completely. But no response came. Admiral Korath waited an hour, then 2, then 6, and still the communication channels remained silent, except for the ordinary chatter of human daily life. He pulled up feeds from human news broadcasts, expecting to see panic in the streets and emergency government sessions and military mobilizations. Instead, He saw a cooking show where a cheerful woman was explaining how to make something called lasagna, and a sporting event where humans chased a ball across a field while thousands cheered, and a children's program about a talking sponge that lived underwater. He saw traffic moving through city streets at normal speeds and people sitting in outdoor cafes, drinking coffee, and children walking to school with bags on their backs. He saw a world that was completely and utterly ignoring the most powerful military force in the galaxy. "This is a trick," Admiral Korath muttered to his second-in-command, a scarred Veth warrior named Cross. "They are pretending to be calm to hide their true fear. Shall I order psychological scans of the population?" Cross asked. Korath nodded, and within the hour, the fleet's advanced sensors had analyzed stress hormone levels across every major human population center. The results made no sense. Human stress levels had actually decreased since the fleet's arrival. As if the presence of 3,000 warships was somehow relaxing to them, Korath demanded the scans be run again. Then a third time, and each time the results came back the same. The humans were not afraid. And they were not pretending, because you could not fake the chemical responses of an entire species days past. And the fleet maintained its position around Earth, waiting for something to happen on the planet below. Humanity continued to live as if nothing unusual was occurring. Farmers planted their crops and tended their animals without glancing at the sky. And factory workers went to their jobs and came home to their families. And artists created beautiful things, and musicians played beautiful songs. And scientists published papers about black holes and quantum mechanics and the mating habits of certain deep-sea creatures, a human news anchor reported on the alien fleet the same way she might report on weather patterns. The hegemony fleet remains in stable orbit today with no changes expected. And now here is Tom with the sports update. Admiral Korath began to feel something he had never felt before. A kind of creeping frustration that aided him like a slow poison. He was a conqueror who had been trained his entire life to break the will of lesser species. But how could you break the will of a species that simply did not care about your presence on the seventh day? He ordered a demonstration of hegemony power. A single warship descended into Earth's atmosphere and targeted an unpopulated island in the middle of the ocean. And with one blast of its primary weapon, it reduced the island to molten glass and boiling steam. Surely this would finally provoke the fear response he needed. The next day, he received a message from the United Earth Council, and his translator struggled with it for several minutes, because it contained concepts the hegemony had never encountered before. It was an invoice. The humans were billing him for environmental damages, including the destruction of protected seabird habitats and the disruption of migratory fish patterns and the release of harmful particles into the atmosphere. The total came to 3 billion of something called credits, and the invoice politely requested payment within 30 standard days to avoid late fees. Admiral Korath stared at the document for a very long time, and then he threw his datapad across the bridge in a rage that startled every officer present. "They are mocking us," he snarled, but deep in his heart, in a place he would never admit existed, a terrible thought was beginning to form. What if they were not mocking him at all? And what if this was simply who they were? A species so fundamentally strange that they had evolved beyond the reach of fear itself on Earth. Secretary General Santos received reports of the Admiral's outburst and smiled quietly to herself. "It is working," she said to General Chun, who stood beside her in the council chamber. "They do not know what to do with us because we are not playing their game. How long can we keep this up?" The general asked. "As long as we need to," she replied. "We have spent our entire history learning how to endure, General, and we have become very good at it. So let them sit in our sky and point their weapons at us. Because we have things to do and lives to live, and we will not put those things on hold for anyone. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Geneva, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to mock the dark shapes of the alien ships hovering above. A child was playing in the park below, laughing as her father pushed her on a swing, and neither of them looked up at the sky even once. This was the weapon that humanity had discovered. Not a bomb or a laser or a fleet of warships, but something far more powerful. The simple refusal to be afraid, and in orbit above, 3,000 warships waited for an enemy that would not come. Piloted by warriors who were beginning to wonder if they had finally met a species they could not conquer. 3 months had passed since the hegemony fleet arrived in Earth orbit, and something was beginning to break inside. The greatest military force the galaxy had ever known, Admiral Korath, had stopped leaving his quarters most days, because every time he walked the corridors of his flagship, he saw the haunted looks in his soldiers' eyes and heard the whispers that stopped whenever he approached. The fleet that had conquered 1,000 worlds was falling apart, not from enemy fire or clever tactics, but from something far worse. The crushing weight of being completely and utterly ignored. It had started with small things. A Corvani patrol ship had descended to observe a human farming community in a place called Kansas, and the pilot had expected the humans to flee or hide, or at least show some sign of the terror that all conquered species displayed instead. An old farmer had walked out of his house, looked up at the hovering warship, and waved. Then he had called out to ask if the pilot wanted to come down for something called iced tea, because it was a hot day, and the farmer figured anyone sitting in a metal ship must be cooking up there. The pilot had reported the incident to her superiors, who had dismissed it as an isolated strange behavior. But then similar reports began flooding in from across the planet. A group of human children had thrown a ball at a Veth Scout walker, not in anger, but because they wanted to play a game and thought the giant alien machine might want to join them. A human musician had set up his instrument outside a hegemony landing zone and played songs for the soldiers who stood guard there. And when they did not shoot him, he had returned every day for a week until some of the soldiers began tapping their feet to the rhythm. A human woman had approached a fully armed Corvani patrol in a city called Tokyo and asked them for directions to a noodle restaurant, apparently assuming they were tourists who might know the area. None of this made any sense to warriors who had been trained from birth to inspire fear and demand submission. They had never learned what to do when someone simply treated them as neighbors who happened to be visiting. The psychological effects on the fleet were devastating. Soldiers who had proudly served the hegemony for decades began questioning the purpose of their mission. Because how could you conquer a people who did not seem to notice they were being conquered? A Veth commander named Thesa had been ordered to intimidate a coastal village in a region called Portugal, and she had marched into the village square with her squad of elite warriors, weapons drawn and ready for the screaming and begging that always came. Instead, an elderly woman had emerged from a nearby building, looked at the soldiers with mild interest, and invited them inside for lunch because she had made too much fish stew and it would be a shame to waste it. Thesa had refused, of course, because hegemony soldiers did not eat with conquered populations. But the old woman had simply shrugged and said the offer was open if they changed their minds. And then she had gone back inside as if a squad of alien warriors was no more concerning than a group of stray cats. That night, Thesa had sat alone in her quarters and cried for the first time since she was a child, though she could not explain why on earth. The humans had begun to study what they were doing, because they wanted to understand why it was working so well. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a professor of psychology at a university in Argentina, and she had spent the past 3 months researching the phenomenon she called passive resistance through radical indifference. Her paper was published in every major scientific journal on the planet, and it explained in clear terms what humanity had discovered by accident. Fear was not something that existed outside of people, she wrote, but something that lived inside them and was given to others like a gift. When you were afraid of someone, you were actually giving them a piece of your power, and the more afraid you were, the more power you gave away. The Galactic Hegemony had built their entire empire on this simple transaction. They threatened violence. Species became afraid. And that fear gave the hegemony all the power they needed to rule. But humanity had broken the transaction by refusing to give their fear away. You cannot take power that is not offered, Dr. Vasquez explained, and you cannot rule over people who do not acknowledge your authority. Because authority itself is just a story that people agree to believe. The humans had simply decided to believe a different story, one in which the alien fleet in their sky was irrelevant to their daily lives, and because they believed it so completely, it had become true. Admiral Karath read the paper when his intelligence officers brought it to him, and he felt a chill run down his spine as he finally understood what he was facing. This was not a species that had found a clever trick or a temporary strategy, but a species that had genuinely evolved beyond the reach of the weapon the hegemony had used for 3,000 years. They were not pretending to be unafraid, because pretending would have required effort and focus and energy. They simply did not care. And that was something he could not fight. The first desertion happened 2 weeks later. A Kovani shuttle pilot named Vex had been assigned to patrol the skies above a city called Melbourne. And one day, she simply landed her shuttle in a park and walked away when hegemony soldiers came to arrest her. They found her sitting at a cafe with a group of humans, learning how to play a card game called poker and laughing at jokes she did not fully understand. She refused to return to the fleet. There is no point, she told the soldiers who had come for her. We cannot conquer these people because they have nothing we can take from them. And I am tired of pretending otherwise. More desertions followed, and then more, until Admiral Karath was forced to report to the Hegemony Council that he was losing soldiers faster than he was losing battles. Except there were no battles to lose. He requested permission to withdraw the fleet and return home, but the Council refused, because the Hegemony had never retreated from a conquest, and they would not start now, so the fleet remained in orbit, bleeding soldiers' insanity with each passing day, while below them, humanity continued to live and laugh and love as if they were alone in the universe. And in a small village in Portugal, a VF commander named Thissa finally accepted an old woman's invitation to lunch. And she discovered that fish stew was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and in all that time, they had never faced a crisis like the one that was now tearing their empire apart. It had started on Earth, with a species that refused to be afraid, but it had not stayed on Earth. The footage had spread across the galaxy like a virus, transmitted through trade ships and smuggler networks and diplomatic channels until every conquered species had seen it. Humans going about their ordinary lives while the greatest military force in existence hovered uselessly above them. And something had changed in the minds of 1 trillion enslaved beings on the planet Veth Prime, the birthplace of the warrior caste that had helped the Kurvani build their empire. Factory workers simply stopped working one morning. They did not riot or rebel or fight their overseers, because violence would have been met with violence, and the hegemony always won those battles. Instead, they sat down at their stations and refused to move. And when soldiers came to force them back to work, the workers looked at them with calm eyes and said nothing at all. The soldiers did not know what to do, because their training had prepared them for enemies who fought back, not enemies who simply stopped participating. More worlds followed Veth Prime's example on Korath 7. The agricultural workers who fed 100 hegemony worlds let their crops rot in the fields because they had decided they were tired of working for masters who gave them nothing in return. On the mining colonies of the Outer Rim, slaves refused to enter the tunnels, and they explained to their confused guards that they had watched the humans on Earth and realized something important. You could only be a slave if you agreed to act like one. The Hegemony Council met an emergency session on their capital world, and for the first time in 3 millennia, there was genuine fear in the chamber. "This is impossible," declared High Counselor Vethal, the same ambassador who had first visited Earth and dismissed the humans as primitives. "Our empire is built on order and obedience, and these populations cannot simply choose to disobey, but they could, and they were. And nothing the council tried seemed to stop it. They sent soldiers to force compliance. But the soldiers found themselves facing crowds of silent, unresisting beings who looked at them with the same calm expression the humans had shown. And many of the soldiers found they could not bring themselves to fire on people who were not fighting back. They cut off food supplies to rebellious worlds. But the rebels simply shared what little they had and continued their peaceful resistance. And footage of starving workers refusing to break spread across the galaxy and inspired even more uprisings. They executed rebel leaders. But new leaders simply appeared to take their places. And these new leaders did not make speeches or issue demands because they had learned from Earth that the most powerful statement was no. Statement at all. Admiral Korath was recalled from Earth to help deal with the spreading chaos. And he arrived at the capital world, a broken man. The council demanded to know why he had failed to conquer a single primitive planet. And he gave them the only answer he had. "You cannot conquer a people who do not care if they are conquered," he said. And now the whole galaxy has learned this lesson from a species we dismissed as irrelevant before he left Earth. Korath had requested one final meeting with Secretary General Santos, and she had agreed to see him in the same conference room where this had all begun. He had asked her the question that had haunted him for months. "Why are you not afraid?" And she had given him an answer that he would never forget. "Admiral," she had said, "humanity has spent its entire history being afraid of something, and we discovered that fear never actually protected us from anything, because the things we feared happened anyway. And the only thing fear accomplished was making us miserable while we waited for them." She had poured him a cup of that strange bitter drink called coffee and continued, "We decided that if bad things were going to happen regardless, we might as well enjoy our lives until they did. And an interesting thing happened when we made that decision. We discovered that most of the bad things we feared were only bad because we were afraid of them." Korath had not understood at the time, but now, watching his empire crumble around him, he finally did. The hegemony's power had never been real, because power that depends entirely on other people's fear is not power at all, but a kind of elaborate performance that only works as long as everyone agrees to play their part. The humans had stopped playing, and now the whole galaxy was following their example on Earth. Humanity watched the news of the collapsing hegemony with the same calm interest they showed to everything else. Dr. Elena Vasquez was interviewed on a news program about her famous paper, and the host asked her if she felt proud that her work had helped bring down an empire. "I did not bring down anything," she replied. "I only described what we were already doing." And the galaxy chose to listen because they were ready to hear it. She paused and looked directly at the camera. Every enslaved species in the hegemony had the power to free themselves at any moment, she said, because slavery only exists when the slave agrees to be a slave. And freedom only requires one decision, the decision to stop agreeing. The interviewer asked if she was worried that the collapse of the hegemony might lead to chaos and violence across the galaxy. Dr. Vasquez smiled. "There is always a risk of chaos when old systems fall," she admitted. "But I have faith that beings who have learned to free themselves through peace will continue to choose peace, because violence is just another form of fear, and they have already proven they are beyond that, in orbit above Earth. The last hegemony ships were preparing to leave, recalled to defend a capital that was already falling and on 1,000 worlds across the galaxy. Former slaves looked up at the stars and smiled, because they had learned the greatest lesson that humanity had to teach. The only chains that truly bind you are the ones you choose to wear. 10 years had passed since the hegemony fleet first appeared in Earth's sky, and the galaxy had become a very different place. The great empire that had ruled for 3,000 years was gone, not destroyed by war or revolution, but simply dissolved like morning fog under a rising sun. Because an empire built on fear cannot survive when fear itself becomes extinct. The Corvani homeworld was now a democracy, governed by a council of elected representatives who still marveled at how such a simple concept had been denied to them for so long. The Veth warrior caste had transformed into something entirely new, using their strength and discipline not to conquer, but to protect and build. And they had discovered that there was far more honor in creating than in destroying. The countless species who had lived under hegemony rule were now free to choose their own paths, and most of them chose to cooperate with each other in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. Earth had become the unofficial center of this new galactic community, not because humans had conquered anything or forced anyone to follow them, but simply because beings from across the stars wanted to understand the strange species that had changed everything. By doing nothing, tourists arrived by the millions to see the planet that had brought down an empire with coffee and indifference. And they walked the streets of human cities with wonder in their eyes. Some of them wept when they saw children playing in parks without fear, because on their own worlds, such innocent joy had been forbidden for generations. Others sat in human cafes and tasted foods they had never imagined. And they listened to human music and read human books and watched human films. And they began to understand why this species had been so impossible to conquer. Humans did not live to survive. They realized, but lived to experience joy and create beauty and connect with each other. And that was why threats of death had meant so little to them, because a life lived in fear was already a kind of death. And they had refused to die that way. Ambassador Vethel, the Golvani diplomat who had delivered that first ultimatum to Earth, now lived in a small house by the sea in a region called Brittany. He had not returned to his homeworld after the fall of the hegemony. Because he had discovered something on Earth that he had never known was missing from his life: peace. He spent his days walking on the beach and talking with the local fishermen, who had accepted him without question because humans had a remarkable ability to see individuals rather than species in the evenings. He worked on his memoirs, trying to capture in words what had happened to him and to the galaxy, and trying to explain it to future generations who might not believe that an empire could fall without a single battle being fought. The old farmer from Kansas, whose invitation to tea had started the unraveling of hegemony morale, had become something of a celebrity, though he did not particularly enjoy the attention. His name was Harold Patterson, and he was 87 years old. And he still lived on the same farm his family had worked for 5 generations. Reporters and historians came from across the galaxy to interview him, and they all asked the same question. What had he been thinking when he saw that alien warship hovering above his field? "I was thinking it was a hot day," Harold would always reply, "and that anyone sitting in a metal ship up there must be uncomfortable, and that there was no reason not to be neighborly." The reporters would push for something deeper, some profound philosophy or clever strategy, but Harold would just shrug. "I have been farming this land for 60 years, he would say, "and I have learned that most problems solve themselves if you just keep doing what needs to be done and do not waste energy worrying about things you cannot control." The massive warships that had once darkened Earth's sky had been converted to more peaceful purposes: the eternal dominion Admiral Korth's former flagship was now a nature preserve and museum, home to plants and animals from 100 worlds, and visited by school children who learned about the strange time when the galaxy had been ruled by fear. Korth himself had died 3 years after the fall of the hegemony. But before his death, he had recorded a message that was now played for every visitor to the museum. I spent my life believing that power came from the ability to destroy. His image would say, and I never questioned this belief because everyone around me believed the same thing. But the humans taught me that true power comes from something else entirely, from the ability to choose what you believe and how you respond to the universe around you. His image would pause, and visitors could see the emotion in his alien eyes. They did not defeat us, he would conclude, because defeating us would have required them to become like us, to embrace fear and violence as weapons, and they refused to do this. So instead, they simply made us irrelevant, and in doing so, they showed us a better way to live on the 10th anniversary of First Contact. Secretary General Maria Santos gave a speech to a gathering of beings from across the galaxy. She was older now, her hair white and her face lined with age. But her eyes held the same calm strength that had guided humanity through its greatest challenge. 10 years ago, she said, a great empire came to our world and demanded that we submit or be destroyed. And we chose a third option that they had never considered. We chose to ignore them. The crowd laughed, as they always did at this point in the story. But I want to be clear about something, she continued. We did not do this because we were brave or clever or special, but because we were tired of living in fear, tired of giving our power away to anyone who threatened us, tired of being anything other than exactly who we were. She looked out at the assembled beings, representatives of species that had once been slaves and were now free. The lesson we offer the galaxy is simple, she said. You are the only one who can decide what has power over you, and you are the only one who can decide what you will fear. And if you choose to fear nothing, then nothing can control you. She smiled, the same patient smile that had confused Ambassador Vethel so many years ago. We turned our backs on the hegemony, not because we were ignoring the danger, but because we understood something they did not. The only real danger is the one you carry inside yourself. And we had finally learned to put that burden down. In the audience, a young Corvani child tugged at her mother's hand and asked why the humans had not been scared of the big ships. Her mother, who had been born a slave and had freed herself by sitting down and refusing to move, knelt beside her daughter and thought carefully about her answer, because, little one, she finally said, they had learned the secret that we all have forgotten. Fear is a choice. And they chose differently. The child thought about this for a moment. Can I choose differently too? She asked. Her mother smiled and pulled her close. You already have, she said, by asking that question. And somewhere on Earth, an old farmer looked up at a sky full of stars and waved, just in case anyone up there wanted to come down for some iced tea.